Good afternoon, and welcome to everyone who has tuned in to another special webinar, particularly for parents. And the title of our webinar today is Empowering Inclusivity, Social Emotional Supports and School Disciplinary Policies for Children with Disabilities. We are so happy to have you here and to provide some information to you. We welcome all of our participants and our panel for our session today. The session will be live streamed on our Durham Public Schools Spanish channel, and our panel today consists of representatives from DPS's Exceptional Children's Team and Durham Advocates for Exceptional Children, formerly known as DSNAC, or Durham Special Needs Advisory Council. My name is Crystal Roberts, and I am privileged to moderate this panel from the Office of Public Affairs for Durham Public Schools, and we'll start with our introductions of our panelists, who will then introduce themselves. We'll start with our leader, Dr. Kristen Bell.
Greetings, everyone. My name is Kristen Bell, and I am the Executive Director for the Exceptional Children's Department here in Durham Public Schools.
Krista Saunders.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Krista Saunders. I'm the EC Director of our Specialized Programs and Behavior Support Systems.
Stacy Burns.
Hello, I'm Stacy Burns, and I'm the EC Director serving all middle and high schools.
Wendy Vavrusak.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Wendy Vavrusak, and I am the Exceptional Children's Director for all of elementary schools.
And our parent representative today is Tosh Adams.
Good afternoon. My name is Tosh Adams, and I'm the Vice Chair of DAEC, formerly known as DSNAC. I'm also a parent of a recent DPS graduate. I'd like to start by saying Happy World Autism Acceptance Month. I'm a proud autism mom. As a parent of a young man with disabilities, I understand firsthand the challenges and frustrations that come with navigating the educational system for children with disabilities, particularly focusing on discipline matters. The journey can often feel overwhelming and isolating. One of the most critical aspects of this is understanding the disciplinary procedures and safeguards in place to protect their rights. Discipline can be a particularly sensitive issue, often accompanied with misunderstandings and misconceptions. So today, DAEC has teamed up with Durham Public Schools Exceptional Children's Department to share insights, information about policies and strategies of how we as parents can effectively navigate the complex landscape of the educational system, particularly when it comes to discipline issues involving children with disabilities. And I'll share more about my son's journey in a little while, but for now, I'll turn it back into your hands, Ms. Roberts.
Thank you so much, Tosh, and we look forward to hearing more from you, as well as from those who have tuned in today, because we certainly want to hear from our parents, and we want that parent voice. We look forward to hearing from each of you. And from our panelists today, you will have proactive strategies and how to enlist support for your child. And we'll ask Dr. Bell to start us off by sharing the purpose of our session today.
Yeah, I do not have much more to add to what Ms. Adams, she nailed it. Everything that she said. This is a session that is targeted for parents and caregivers, specific to students with disabilities, specifically for students who have individualized education programs or IEPs. So there's a specific process where they've been evaluated and found eligible under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. So that's the focus of today, very parent focused. And we also know that there's a lot with this topic, and it can be, like Ms. Adams said, very, very complicated just to navigate school, let alone special education policies. So this is a session that we'll hold today, and we're more than happy to have a follow-up. If we don't get through everything today that we intended, we can always do a part 2, but happy to have folks joining us today and ready to get started. So thank you for being here.
And for those of you who have tuned in, please know that we are watching and awaiting your questions, and we will try to get to every question that is posed to us. But we're going to kick it off with a question to Dr. Bell, and would like for Ms. Adams to weigh in as well. Is there a different disciplinary process for exceptional children students versus non-exceptional children students? And then on the different levels, Dr. Bell, pre-K, elementary, middle, and high school, is there a difference there?
Great kickoff question. Yeah, we'd like to start with just making sure that people are aware that what do we define as discipline? A lot of people think of discipline and they automatically default to suspension or removal, and that is a big part of our conversation today. But discipline can also mean it's just a consequence. Could be talking with a student, having a restorative circle, could be some in-school option or an out-of-school option. It could mean a conversation with a parent. But specific today's session, we're talking about when there's a violation of student code of conduct. So in Durham Public Schools school board policy, there's a code of conduct for elementary and there's one for secondary. And essentially that lays out the specific rules of student behavior and expectations to maintain a safe and orderly and learning environment for all students. There are things that we want students to be able to do successfully. So in terms of discipline for the levels, essentially building principles, and this is really important to start the basis of conversation of building principles have the autonomy and the authority to dole out discipline based on any violation of the code of conduct and their interpretation of that. So what we do want to see happen, and we do often see happen, is that principals will use different information to make decisions at different levels. There's a very different scenario with a preschool student who may have violated a code of conduct based on their age, their developmental level, the specifics of their disability. There could be differences at the elementary and definitely all the way up until secondary, right? So principals are constantly getting all of the information when something has happened to investigate and research and get all the details to be able to make a decision about what the disciplinary action needs to be. So I'll leave it at that. And now definitely, as we go throughout the session, if any of my colleagues or Ms. Adams want to chime in, please feel free to add to that.
Ms. Adams, what has your experience been as a parent and the disciplinary process?
Well, I'll preface my response by mentioning that my son spent most of his elementary and middle school in another county. So a lot of my experiences did not occur in Durham County. So we requested evaluation several times and our requests were ignored. It wasn't until we moved to Durham and when he was in the 5th grade where I got an evaluation and a 504 plan. And during this time, we had very minimal disciplinary issues. We returned to our previous county for middle school. And at that time, my son had probably about a dozen short-term suspensions and one long-term suspension. In that county, they did not have any alternative educational settings available, nor was he able to, they didn't provide the assignments that he was missing while he was away. And that being at the very end of the school year, he was missing the end of the grade testing. And it wasn't until I actually mentioned it to my mom, who's a high school social worker, who said, you know, you can get a manifestation meeting, you can request that. I had no idea that I could do that. So we had that manifestation meeting and he was also able to make up his testing. Following that, again, moved back and forth between the two cities, and we finally decided to stay with Durham for high school, where we knew there were a plethora of resources that were available. Then we were able to get our IEP. We had a few hiccups here and there, but he was able to go to Lakeview School whenever he did have some suspensions, and he was able to receive his instruction and get his assignments done. And he was at Creative Studies, where he had an amazing EC facilitator who worked closely with us to address our concerns. We knew his triggers, we knew some of his patterns, and we were able to develop a plan from that information. So we were being proactive rather than being reactive like we had done previously. So that helped tremendously. And so I began to see his love for learning again. I started to see him making friends and joining some mentoring groups that were at his school.
That is great information. Thank you, Ms. Adams. And I'm going to pitch the next question to Wendy. Dr. Bell mentioned the fact that when you think of discipline, the first thing you may think of is suspension. Does having a behavior intervention plan, an IEP, or a 504 plan prevent your student from being suspended?
Thank you, Crystal. students who have plans of various types of which you've named are subject and under disciplinary reasons like all students, at least for a certain number of days. So there are exceptions that come into play after a student has had 10 days of suspension. That could be in small increments, that could be in one long increment. When we cross over those first 10 days, then there are special provisions that come into play for students with 504 plans and IEPs. And we also are wanting to make sure that we capture any types of situations where students might be leaving in partial days. So we would be looking at that too, and whether or not that's being implemented by the school, or if a parent's choosing to pick up, then we wouldn't necessarily count that. But however, if a school implements that, we would need to be counting that as well. But up through those first 10 days, a student is subject to the code of conduct like all students.
Thank you very much. That's excellent to know. This next question, I'm going to bring Dr. Bell back in and ask you to explain the process for determining what level of discipline an exceptional children's student will receive, and what does lead to suspension.
That's a really complicated question because it's one of those, it depends on a lot of different factors, and it is left to the discretion of the school administrator. So we go back to that code of conduct. It's really important to be really clear on what happened, what the incident was, that the administrator or administrators would make sure that they have all the information, what exactly happened, if there's different perspectives, if they need to talk to different people to get the facts. And then they would make a decision based on the specific code of conduct that was violated. There are things that principals consider, like we talked about before, is like the level of the offense, the severity of it, the disruption to the learning environment. Was there harm caused to any other individuals or to property? All of those are things that, and there's many more factors that principals take into consideration, and they're called, there's an expectation that administrators are looking at what's called aggravating and mitigating factors. So things related to the circumstance that will help form their decision about what is a fair and just disciplinary consequence. The other side of that is we work really closely with principals to make sure that they know if it's a student with a disability that has a plan. Did we follow the plan? Was the student getting the support that they needed? What is the nature of that child's particular disability and how that may have caused or influenced whatever to happen? Those are all just factors that the administrator would still consider, but like the question before, it doesn't automatically mean because they have the IEP or disability that there won't be a disciplinary action. And again, disciplinary actions can be a lot of different things. It's not always that out of school suspension, but it could be. It could be that the administrator's meeting with the student, or they might be doing a circle with other students involved. They could be involving the parents. There could be various actions depending on the level of infraction and all of those other factors that we just talked about.
Thank you so much. And it looks like we have a question from Facebook, and I'm going to pose the question, and whichever of our experts want to weigh in, please do so. The question is, can you speak to services that children are experiencing school avoidance due to anxiety, ASD, depression, etc.? What options might be offered for homebound or other options since these students aren't being truant and since it's due to a diagnosis? And I can repeat it if you'd like, because it was a two-part question.
I'll start and I'll expect my colleagues to chip in because I will miss parts of this. So buy you guys some more think time there. So students who are experiencing, they may be avoiding school or not attending school because of official anxiety diagnoses, autism spectrum disorder, or other factors that are somehow preventing them from coming to school. How do we support those students essentially, right? And I think those could be students who also don't have an IEP. they could or couldn't. They might have an IEP, they could have a 504, or they might have neither of those two. Schools should be aware that if it's excessively impacting a student's attendance, to take action. In some cases, that may be a child find issue. If we have a student with those diagnoses that's not attending, that's a pretty adverse effect. That may trigger the school to make a referral for exceptional children if the student has not already been identified. So that could be a child find issue right there, where we would want to come to the table and say, hey, does the student have a disability or suspected disability that we may need to evaluate and see if they need a little bit more, or refer to 504, one of those options, or both. The other thing is, we're going to talk later too, involving the right people to support the child, like definitely bringing in the parent and the student when appropriate and able, depending on the age and other circumstances with the student. School counselor is a critical resource that can provide support. School social workers are sometimes involved, and definitely school administration, to kind of like, regardless of the avenue, taking a team approach to problem solve. What is impeding this child's ability to come to school, and how can we strategize? The other thing is, we want to make sure not all situations, but some students are connected to outside agencies. They may have medical doctors or psychiatrists or mental health providers. We always ask parents to give us consent to work with those providers, because the more that we can partner and find out what's happening on that end, and if we can duplicate efforts or use the right, the language strategies that they are seeing work, we want to be open to considering those kinds of things. I know there's more to this question, so I'll tap to whoever else on the team wants to. That was a great question.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I'll just add that for students who have IEPs, who have mental health diagnosis, they may be impacting their ability to attend school. Like Dr. Bell said, we really like to collaborate with any community provider or mental health professional. If we oftentimes will receive notes from doctors saying that a student is unable to participate in school at this time due to such and such diagnoses. And when a school team receives that kind of note, they have an obligation to meet as an IEP team to consider, what then do we need to do as a school team to ensure the student can access their services? And that's when we might talk about things like modifying the school day potentially. Maybe mornings are really difficult. So maybe the school team might decide that the student would come in later. Maybe afternoons are difficult. Maybe a full school day is difficult. So looking at where, for this particular student, how that diagnosis is impacting their school day. And then to the most restrictive, we might look at homebound services. And those are always the goal to be temporary. So when a student is placed on homebound, that IEP team is meeting every 4 to 6 weeks to talk about, is the student able to come back to school, and what does that transition back to school look like? And so those are some other things, ways we can support students. Obviously through behavior intervention plans as well, which we're going to talk about in a little bit, and things like that.
Crystal, while you are answering that question, there is another question that may be related, and it's in reference to a parent receiving a call. If a parent receives a call letting them know that their child is experiencing behavioral issues, are you asking them to pick their child up, or is this just for information? And when does this become a suspension?
That is an excellent question that we receive quite often. So if, as a parent, you're receiving a call because your student is having some behaviors during the school day, and they directly ask you to pick the child up, then you should also be receiving a notice of suspension. If they call you and are sharing information, and they say, I'm just sharing information, I'm not asking you to come get your student, and you choose to come get your student, then it's not a suspension. Some advice we'll often share with teachers and school administrators is, unless it is an immediate emergency, maybe wait. You don't need to call right during the incident unless it's part of the student's plan. You can call at the end of the day and say, here's what happened today. Just want to let you know. Here's the behavior that occurred. Here's how it was resolved. Just wanted to keep you informed. That way, there's less confusion, because there's always a lot of confusion when a parent receives a call, right? As a parent, if I'm getting a call during the school day from a teacher and you're telling me my child is having a really difficult time with their behavior, I feel like I'm probably hearing you want me to come get them. And so we need to make sure as school staff that we're extremely explicit if we're calling in the middle of the day and we're not choosing to suspend, that we are very clear that we are not asking you to come get your child, that we are just reporting this information to you. But again, if you are asked to come pick up your child, you should also be receiving a notice of suspension.
Thank you so much. And I'll do a follow-up that I will pitch to Stacy. And then we've got a couple of questions coming from Facebook as well. Stacy, if a student is suspended, what are school alternatives for students?
Oh, great. Great question. So, it depends on the age. So if a student from grades 3 in elementary school, beginning at age 3, they can go to New Directions. That's in our, it's in the same building as the dorm Performance Learning Center. And if the students are in middle school, they have 2 options, and same as high school, they have 2 options where they can also go to New Directions and they can go to Lakeview. So this way, students can continue, although they're on a suspension, they can continue to receive their services in their IEP and also on any content that they may receive for general ed as well.
Thank you to both of you for those very comprehensive responses. Thank you so much. Here's a question from Facebook. Should the school ensure that all aspects of IEP support are being followed before enforcing discipline? Who'd like to answer that one?
I'll jump in, so there's limited delay, but you guys help me out. I would say, should they? Yeah, we should always make sure that we're implementing the IEP regardless, because it's a legal document. That should always be the case. We need to be doing what we said we would be doing with fidelity and consistency and collecting data on that. So in the ideal world, yes, we want principals to know who those students are and what services should have been provided, because there could be a scenario where, say, a student has a behavior intervention plan, certain things targeted for that behavior that occurred. We want to know, that principal know, did we do those things? Did we say what we did, or did our failure to do that? And this will come up later when we talk more about MDRs. Did our failure to do that actually cause this behavior? So the principal will want to know those things. And that's it should be part of their investigation before they're doling out the discipline, is getting all those facts together. Now, policy does not say that prevents them from suspending, right? So let's be real about that. If they're, if they didn't do due diligence, or even if they did and found something, they still have the authority under state statute to suspend the child. So that's part of our training and conversations with principals. Please do find that information out, because that could impact and influence your disciplinary decision for that child.
Anyone else want to weigh in on that one?
I just agree with Dr. Bell on that, and also that's a practice that we try to implement where principals are leading into a suspension. And so looking at the IEP, making sure if the student has a behavior intervention plan, or even in the process of an evaluation, looking and making sure that, and as Dr. Bell said, training principals on that practice, that they're checking with their EC facilitator, the EC teacher, that they're making sure that, and like Dr. Bell said, doesn't mean that the student won't receive a disciplinary action, but it might be the difference between, RPC, Restorative Practice Center, the classroom, or out of school, maybe 2 days versus 1 day versus 2, that sort of thing. So, yeah.
Thank you so much. We have another question from Facebook. That question is, who holds the principals accountable for fair application of aggravating or mitigating circumstances, as a parent and child have no way to formally appeal a short-term suspension?
Another great question. And that's accurate. Board policy, state policy, short-term suspensions can't be appealed, but long-term suspensions, and that's long-term is anything recommended over 10 days. So the accountability piece is huge. If there's disagreement, if the parent doesn't feel due diligence had been done for those things to be considered, they should first communicate with the administrator and see the openness to have a conversation, or at least be able to share their thoughts on that. And if they still feel like there's an injustice done, or processes or procedures weren't adhere to, or there was information that wasn't considered that the parent feels strongly, they can also follow up with the principal supervisor. I mean, we always encourage parents to talk with the administration first. Anything that can be handled at the school level with the people who work with the child is always the best avenue. We know that sometimes doesn't always work out that way, but there are principal supervisors that can be reached out to, as well as, and Stacy might help you out, have you help me out here. I know it's Darnice Massey. I'm not sure of her exact title, but there's a position in Durham, kind of like an ombudsman position, where parents can contact to share their concerns if they didn't feel like they were resolved or heard at the school level. And that person will get involved and take down the concerns and do what they can to listen. And if there is opportunity for resolution, to try to find that. And there may or may not be, but there are avenues for parents to kind of escalate and elevate their concerns outside of things that might be in place more formally through policy that aren't available through short-term suspensions.
Okay.
And her title is Family Involvement and Community Engagement Coordinator.
Thank you. We have another question from Facebook, and thank you so much for your questions. Since school administrators have discretion for discipline policy implementation, what training and professional development specifically related to disability is required and or made available to school administration? And they're saying not just for legal issues like IDEA or IEP compliance.
So I think it's twofold. We provided training over the years for principals on disciplinary, just disciplinary action suspensions, and including the manifestation determination as we get, and so we'll talk more about that as we get into further down the questions. But also too, we're getting ready to do another series of trainings as well. But I do want to say that it's just not the training that we provide. All of us on this call in our department, including facilitators as well, is as things come up, we do talk with principals. So there's that on the spot support, if you will. We all have conversations with principals. We're visible in schools. So as things come up, principals do lean to us. So we actually do talk with them one-on-one about it's not just collectively, but as individually as student cases come up as well.
I'll add too. I know there's been training over the years from our student support services department, just globally around discipline for all students, interpretation of the code of conduct, and how to make decisions around appropriate disciplinary actions. Our research and accountability department is, sharing the data around suspensions to schools. So there's analysis and conversations around any disproportionality that may be happening. So things like that, like Stacy said, we actually do have more training coming up, hopefully this summer, specifically that will be required of principals and APs, specific to this topic of discipline with students with disabilities.
And I'll just add, we have principals that request training for their entire school building on supporting students with disabilities, particularly around strategies for behavior. And so there are schools I've been to for part 1, part 2, and part 3 training sessions for their entire staff, which includes the administrative staff. So there's that training that is often happening as well.
Thank you so much. We'll move right along, and we have had a rather robust discussion about code of conduct and administrator processes. Now let's talk about interventions to support students with social and emotional needs. And I'm going to pitch this question to Ms. Saunders. And that question is, how do schools address social emotional learning for students at school while they're at school?
It's a great question. One of my favorite topics, social emotional learning, or what you might hear as SEL. At this point in time, all of our schools in Durham Public Schools have adopted an SEL curriculum. That's for all students, both the students with and without disabilities. So that's kind of your baseline foundational implementation of SEL at the school level. In addition to that, the EC department provides research-based social skills programs to our EC staff to implement specifically for students with disabilities. We have a few different programs depending on the grade level, the needs of the student. As far as our EC specialized programs, so our people might refer to them as separate settings, our small classes specifically for students with significant disabilities. In those classes, we are implementing research-based social skills curriculums daily. And so that is part of the programming, just like we are implementing math and reading and writing. So we are doing a lot of social emotional learning here in DPS.
That's wonderful to know. And I'll ask you another question, Ms. Saunders, in terms of determination for those supports. When does a team determine a student needs a behavior intervention plan?
Yeah, great question. This comes up a lot. So when we're in schools, we talk about interventions in tiers. Tier 1 being your first level of supports that kind of most everybody's getting. Tier 2, middle ground, and Tier 3, your really intensive intervention when nothing in Tier 1 and nothing in Tier 2 is working. A behavior intervention plan is what we would consider a Tier 3 intervention. Want to be one of your most intensive interventions for students who are presenting with chronic problem behaviors. So a team might consider conducting what we call a functional behavior assessment. And we would do that to gather data to develop a behavior intervention plan. And that is only done when everything else is not working. And the goal of that functional behavior assessment is to figure out what is the function of this behavior so we can better target strategies. And that's what the behavior intervention plan is, the strategies for that behavior specific to that function. So a behavior intervention plan is not our first step when a student is exhibiting problem behaviors. For students with IEPs, our first step is going to be to implement classroom-based interventions, meet as an IEP team. We might add behavior goals, objectives. We might add accommodations, modifications. If behavior decreases, wonderful, we're on the right track. If behavior continues to escalate in frequency, intensity, duration, then a team may want to reconvene and consider conducting that functional behavior assessment in order to develop that behavior intervention plan. And if a team does want to conduct a functional behavior assessment, as a parent, we'd need your consent to do that. So the team would meet as an IEP team to conduct a reevaluation in order to get parental consent to do that functional behavior assessment in order to develop that BIP.
Thank you so much. Great information. Yes, Dr. Bell?
Yeah, I just want to take the opportunity too to shout out, there's so many amazing professionals in our schools that can help support with behavior, whether it's a student with a disability or not. Like, I'm going to shout out our school counselors, social workers. We've got amazing school psychologists. We've got a related service team that may work directly with students, but that or not, and they could be consulted with like speech language pathologists, occupational therapists, physical therapists. We have an amazing assistive technology team. So depending on the unique needs of each child, who you might bring to the table to bring those strategies and brainstorm those strategies, there's just so many wonderful people with expertise that are available at the school level that we always strongly encourage. Let's get the right people at the table to figure this out because we can do it.
Absolutely. Thank you for lifting that up, Dr. Bell. Stacy, I have a question for you. How do BIPs, behavioral intervention plans, and disciplinary processes work together?
So, oh goodness. So we're going to get more into it when we get into the MDR, how that all works, but I'll briefly share here and piggybacking off of what Krista said. They are designed to support students in teams with more strategies and supports to be able to help reshape the behavior, if you will. Also, when you're thinking about, when you're talking about just disciplinary practices, as we spoke to before, principals sometimes use that information to determine whether or not that behavior was directly, there are some things in a bit that we need to do to reinforce more positive behavior, right? Is the bit this, or we used all the strategies? So that may mitigate how much time the principal may give the student and for suspension and or whether they assign them to RPC or some type of conversation or consult or processing with maybe the counselor or the EC teacher or themselves as administrators. So Now, when we get into the MDR, we'll talk more about how the BIP is exactly related and how that BIP is used within that process.
Thank you so much. And I'm going to ask our parent representative, Ms. Adams, to weigh in on that question as well. Were you offered, or what supports or adjustments were offered post-disciplinary action to ensure that your child's needs were met? What experience have you had there?
With the high school that he attended, the team worked with him, and they always reiterated that all school rules still applied to him. But I guess the biggest difference is the manner in which they handled the situation. They would even provide him opportunity to check in with his mentor, his teacher, before returning to class after an incident. Or even he'd have a cool down space in the EC facilitator's office. So there were a lot of different supports that were available for him prior to an incident and afterwards.
Good. Thank you so much. So let's move on to disciplinary action before or after 10 days of out-of-school suspension. We have a few questions there that I'd like to pose to the panelists, and we'll go back to Stacy. And the first question is, what is a manifestation determination review, or MDR? Uh-oh, you're muted.
Great question. Sorry about that. So a manifestation determination review is a process that's required by IDEA, Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. It is for students who are facing disciplinary actions, which we call a disciplinary removal, meaning they have passed like the 10-day mark. So anything that's over 10 days, whether it's consecutive or it's cumulative, on the 11th day, that's when the MDR, the protections come into play. And so when we think of an MDR, it is basically to determine whether or not the student's disability, start a little again, whether or not the conduct in question was a manifestation of the student's disability. So in that process, we are reviewing the previous IEP, we're reviewing any evaluations, we're reviewing any disciplinary referrals. We have input from the parent as well, any information that they want to share during that time. And the process for the manifestation determination meeting is very focused on the conduct in question. So we don't go into, well, things he might have did in the past, right? That's not what we're trying to figure out. And we also, it's a narrow focus. And so parents may be upset about the suspension. However, we're not there to argue the principles, the suspension. We're only there to determine whether or not it was caused by the student's disability. So once we review all of that information, and when I say we're talking about the administrator who knows, who can speak to the incident itself. We're talking about the school psychologist, the EC teacher, the general ed teacher, the parent. And for short terms, that's the team. But for long-term suspensions, the EC director, so that would be myself or Wendy, that would serve as the LEA. So this way, we don't have, and there's a conflict of interest, right? We're coming in as a neutral party to be able to review that information. And so once we review all of the data, there's 3 specific questions that we ask that come down to determine whether or not it's a manifestation of the student's disability or not. And the first question is based on the above factors. Was the conduct in question caused by the student's disability? So this question is dealing directly with the student's disability. So emotional disturbance, autism, we're answering that question based on the data we reviewed. And then the second question is similar, and sometimes it confuses teams, but based on the above factors, that the conduct in question have a direct or substantial relationship to the student's disability. And so this question is not a direct result of the disability, but it could be influenced by factors related to the disability. So that question, the first question is direct, but the other one is the file review that we've done, anything that may be in that student's record that says it's closely related to that student's and it has some influence on the conduct in question. And then the last question we have is based on the conduct in question, was it direct result of the school district's failure to implement the IEP? And so that question is not about, so let's just say Johnny got suspended for fighting. And Johnny is a fictitious name that I like to use. I'm not talking about any direct student. So let's just say Johnny got in trouble for fighting and he has math services in his IEP that wasn't delivered. That question is not related to that. What that question is asking specifically if there was something in the IEP where there was an accommodation that wasn't met, whether there was goals and objectives that were related to like fighting or, disruptive behavior. And it was found that that IEP was not implemented, then that question would be yes. But if it's strictly about math goals or something like that, that question wouldn't be related to the conduct in question. And so,
I'm sorry.
So going back to the BIP, because I just forgot about going back to the BIP, the behavior intervention plan is a part of that. So there is a section on the MDR that talks about the BIP. So BIP reviews, does the student have a BIP? You would check yes. It talks about the data revisions, and you have to summarize each revision. So that's actually drawing attention to the team to say, wait a minute, there might have been something wrong, or we might have did something. That's data that we use to determine whether or not it's a manifestation of the student's disability. Then there are two questions that are underneath that talk about pattern of behavior. And then it talks about, has this behavior changed in intensity, frequency, right? So it's a very thorough process. It's not something that you should go through in 15 minutes. It is something where as a team, we're reviewing the data, we're asking questions along the line, and we need to have parent input. So I would recommend to all parents, with that section that comes up, do you have anything that you would like the team to know? I would definitely spend time. So maybe you want to prepare a statement ahead of time that you want to share with the team for the team to review. That's data. And then from that point, also answering the questions. Please involve yourself in answering the questions at the MDR, at the Manifestation Determination Review meeting. The school psychologist is there for all long-term, but even the facilitator is there for all meetings. You should ask for those questions the same way I explained these questions just now. You should ask for those questions to be explained thoroughly, so you will know how to answer those questions and be a full participant in that meeting. Now, if the team can't come to a consensus, then the LEA weighs in to answer the question. And I hope I answered that question.
That was excellent. Yes, Dr. Bell.
Yeah, great job, Stacy. There's so much to it, right, with the MDRs. So the team if they answer yes to any one of those three questions, there's a manifestation that's found, which means that student returns to their placement back at school. And that should happen immediately, which is typically the next school day that the student comes back. And we should make sure that the right supports are in place. The other obligation is for the team to, if there hasn't been an FBA and BIP, to start that process immediately if we find it a manifestation. And if there is one that's been done, that we're reviewing that as part of the process to see if there's anything that we need to change in terms of strategies and supports to specifically address that behavior that resulted in the disciplinary consequence for the student. The other thing is really important is there's 3 specific behaviors that if they occur, the school administration has the authority to remove the student for 45 days outside of any decision around an MDR immediately. And there's significant safety things. They are around bringing a weapon to school. And there's very clear and specific definitions of what meets the criteria for weapon. If there's serious bodily injury that has occurred as a result of the incident, and again, clearly defined in the regs about what that means. It's not just a black eye, it's a serious, like they've seriously harmed someone. Or if they've brought drugs, and there's specific classes of drugs that are defined. So any of those 3, they can be removed for what's called a 45-day interim alternate educational setting. In a lot of those situations too, the team would still proceed also with an MDR, but it gives school authority to immediately remove the student, continue to serve them because of the significance of those the behavior that occurred, and that's in policy.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bell. And while we have you, I'm going to ask you a second question related to that, and then we'll go over to Facebook because there's another question from our viewers there. That question for you, Dr. Bell, is there an appeal process for disciplinary actions taken against exceptional children's students?
Yes, great question. So board policy, there's no appeal for a short-term suspension, but there is for a long-term. And remember, short-term is anything up to 10 days. The principal has the authority. If they want to recommend long-term really means anything over 10 days, and that has to be approved at the superintendent level or his or her designee. So there is an internal process. What we like to do is do the MDR as quickly as possible once we know when is needed. So that, because that decision might influence the parent's decision of whether or not to seek an appeal. If they find it to be a manifestation, there could be parents that go like, I'm good, my kid's coming back to school, but they still may want to appeal. And then the long-term suspension might not even move forward. And I'm going to have Stacy add to this because she's more involved, because this is definitely more of a secondary thing. The other avenue that parents have is with anything EC related. If decisions are made that they disagree with, there's always avenues of filing due process. And that means you're essentially suing the district. We don't want parents to do that, but it is a right. We'd love to work out things internally, and most times we can. But parents have a right to pursue those. They can file state complaints, file due process, request mediations for anything essentially related to the IEP that they feel like is in violation. Stacy, is there anything that you would add to the appeal process that you think parents need to know?
No, just I think for with the MDR process is that if it's not a manifestation and you plan on appealing, I would definitely take notes to make sure you frame what you are actually wanting to say during that time, and making sure that I just want to emphasize parent participation in those processes, just to make sure when you're in the MDR that your voice is definitely needed, because there are some things that we may not know, or some things that are in records that we're not aware of, that if you just bring that to light. So always go and feel free to reach out to with any questions that you have in preparation. If you don't understand it, your EC facilitator or one of us on the call, to reach out to us if you don't understand the process, and we'll definitely explain it to you thoroughly.
And add just one final thing. It is, and Stacy said this earlier, it's really important for parents to know the MDR is not contesting the actual suspension. That is the discipline that the administrator divvied out. The MDR is specifically talking about, did the student's disability cause, or was there a substantial relationship, or did it happen because of a failure to implement the IEP? It's not contesting the decision of the administrator.
Thank you for that clarification, Dr. Bell. And I do have one other question under the disciplinary umbrella, and this question is for Wendy, and then we will address our Facebook questions. Wendy, are disciplinary actions documented in our EC students' permanent record? And if so, what does that look like?
Thank you. Yes, there is a policy about how records, or if records are expunged, relates to student records. And specifically around discipline. And for the most part, the record is essentially gone at the end of the year. However, there are some exceptions to that, which would include when there is a 10-day or recommendation for a long-term suspension, a possible expulsion, or any records that are deemed to needing to be held and maintained for other needs, which could be legal matters or other things in regards to safety of others. But for the most part, like short-term little things happen, those are finished at the end of the record or do not maintain with the student.
Okay, that's good to know. And for our Facebook friends, there are 2 additional questions. How are parents to navigate a situation where a teacher continually triggers the student despite not actually doing anything illegal, i.e., making faces that communicate displeasure with the child, especially when escalations result in restraints and other things, etc.? Who can answer that for us?
Well, I'll give a first go at this. I mean, what we would obviously want to do is have a conversation with the parent and the teacher first. I don't know if there are, some folks, the way they are perceived, nonverbal language, but that question does sound like it's being perceived as an intentional act. So I would first encourage the parent to have a conversation with the teacher, and I would recommend in person as opposed to an email. I think if it's feeling like that is not resolved, the next step is to the principal, who is the ultimate supervisor of that teacher. And it's not always beneficial, but certainly there are maybe some other options. If move into a different classroom, there could be some other discussions about options that might be available to them, but that would definitely come through a conversation with the administrator.
Thank you so very much. Anyone
Yeah.
else?
I'll
And
just
I
add, oh, go ahead, Stacy. I'll go after you. We may say the same thing. Wendy's spot on. I think, again, communicating at the level closest to the student first when possible and comfortable enough with the parent. We know there's a lot of dynamics that go into things, and then escalating to the principal to do some problem solving. There's always other people that can be brought in that I referenced before. Like, this might be where the administrator wants to, have someone come in and do some observations just to see what's really going on, someone who can be neutral and objective and specifically know what to look for in terms of interactions. Like the school counselor, the psychologist, there are people that can come in and really be able to say, hey, here's what I've seen, and here might be some strategies that they're either working directly with the student or the staff member or both. And Stacy, would you add to that?
And so I would say if it doesn't work at the school level with the teacher and the principal, always reach out to one of us on this call. Elementary, Wendy, myself, middle and high school special programs would be Krista. Reach out to us, and then because sometimes it takes a neutral party to come in and be able to help both sides see and come to a common ground.
Thank you so much. And before I ask this final Facebook question, because we have about 5 minutes, I did want to circle back around to Ms. Adams and ask about disciplinary processes that you and your child have experienced and how that has impacted you and your child.
I'll start with the middle school experience in that other county. It was very difficult to motivate him to just want to go to school. And to be honest, at times it was difficult for me to send him to school. I knew I was gonna get that phone call daily. It was gonna come at some point, and I was a teacher as well. So it deeply impacted him because he was often suspended for like some of the same behaviors. It was repeated behaviors. And he didn't understand what he was doing wrong. But when he came to DPS, again, things were different. And I know everyone doesn't have the same story, but for me, this was our situation. The staff took time to talk to him about his actions, the consequences, and just what he could do if he found himself in that position again. And so that was very helpful for us.
Thank you so much. We have one final question, as we have about 4 minutes before we have to wrap, from Facebook. And that question is, does the district plan to evaluate SEL curriculum for all students using research showing that social expectations taught in typical SEL are unsupportive and potentially harmful to autistic and neurodivergent students because it encourages social masking, which leads to negative outcomes, including suicidality?
So I can start, Crystal. So all of our programs that we utilize in our EC specialized programs and for students with disabilities that are implemented specifically by our EC teachers all of that is considered, and a lot of our programs are designed specifically to support the needs of students with autism and related social emotional communication needs. So we are addressing a lot of those things and are aware of those things. So I can just speak for that for the EC purchase curriculums. Yeah.
And I can add more too. I think it's a great question, like how it's a constant continuous improvement in making sure that the practices that we're promoting and using with students are current and up to date and based on current research and fully researched. And I know for a fact that it's a multifaceted approach that we take. It's not just an SEL curriculum. I think we provide great training to our staff in our district. I'm very proud of what we offer, and really encourage people to approach things from a therapeutic lens, and really individualizing for students rather than kind of blanketly saying this works for all students who are autistic or this works for, we don't promote that. And that would be negligent. Really trying to individualize based on that child's needs and supporting the people who work with that child with effective practices that are humane and compassionate and research and evidence-based is a huge focus of our work. And if we definitely want, if parents feeling that that's not being done, to lift that up and raise it up so that we can address it.
Dr. Bell, I am proud as well, and I want to thank each of you, each of the experts who have come today to share information and supports for those who are tuned in and listening. And Ms. Adams, for your expertise and for sharing your experiences as well. We thank you kindly. And Dr. Bell, if you'd like to wrap us, we have about 1 minute.
And that's probably 40 seconds more than I need. Thank you everyone for being a part of this panel. Crystal, your moderation skills are explicit. Ms. Adams, wonderful. Thank you. It's very vulnerable to be out there as a parent and share. You did a fantastic job and we're very grateful for you, as well as our partnership with Durham Advocates for Exceptional Children. Definitely encourage parents to explore their website on Facebook and learn more about what they do. And I think, okay, I didn't get cut off there. But thank you for everyone who participated live. We know this will be accessible archived, so we hope you'll watch it and reach out to your school or our team if you have additional questions. This is you can use your camera to access this QR code. Hopefully it'll work, where it's a document we put together for parents that has some resources around everything that we talked about today. So hopefully you can check that out. Thank you so much for being a part of this.